Tormented Souls 2 carries a quite particular development context, mainly for being created by an independent studio, Dual Effect, which gained respect among survival horror fans with the first game in 2021. The studio seems to work almost as a guardian of a forgotten tradition, rowing against the tide of AAA games that load up on action and leave psychological horror in the background. In the development context, the effort to maintain fixed cameras and tank-type controls stands out in an era where fluid movement and third-person perspective are expected. The game was born, above all, from the developer's passion for the classic genre, and this is made clear by the maintenance of these elements down to the bases of the design. What is most observed is that Dual Effect chose to evolve without losing its identity. They could have gone for something more cinematic, more polished, traded fixed cameras for free movement, or simplified puzzles to please more audiences. But they preferred to improve what was already working. For example, there is a noticeable graphical leap, mainly due to the use of Unreal Engine, something rare in indie projects of this size. The environments became more detailed, and the atmosphere gained a life of its own, but everything always directed to the 90s vibe, with claustrophobic corridors, a much more refined light and shadow choreography, but without losing that chill down the spine. Dual Effect seems determined to deepen the narrative in Tormented Souls 2, using themes such as cults, rituals, and family, without giving up the tradition of trash horror from the 90s, the one that makes you laugh and get scared at the same time. Caroline, once again, faces situations that are pure nightmare, but now with her sister Anna involved and a plot of a cult, macabre nuns, and a darker, more intimate atmosphere. The development focused heavily on mystery, on the unspoken, and this choice helps to create immersion, encouraging the player to explore documents and piece together the plot like in the old days. It is a development that seems resistant to the pasteurization of the mainstream and bets on slow and uncomfortable mystery. Another interesting point in the production context was the choice of settings. Hospital, convent, and external environments promise more variety than in its predecessor, and this seems to be a merit of the expanded scope without losing control over detailing. The demo shows concern with creating labyrinthine spaces, where every corner is designed to play with the player's expectation. You can feel that the developers have carefully studied the classics, but have also sought to imprint personality on the designs, colors, and the balance between light-shadow. They bet on the environments to tell part of the story and captivate the player with atmosphere. On the technical side, it was clear from the start that the second game would be more ambitious. Even with indie limitations, the team is working to deliver a greater polish than in Tormented Souls 1, with a powerful engine and more narrative sound and visual resources. But honestly, there is still a certain stiffness in the character animations, something that gives it a retro charm, but can annoy those seeking total fluidity. As someone who grew up with these games, I see this almost as a seal of authenticity. It even gives that old-fashioned pride. Going beyond the technical limitations, the creative context favors complicated and disconnected puzzles, celebrating the typical absurdities of classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The development invested time in creating challenges that seem to lack direct logic, but deep down are there to force that moment of insight that only retro horror fans understand. For those who find everything too traditional, it might seem repetitive, but there is clear care in innovating in complexity without taking away the pleasure of frustration and challenge. You can feel that the team wanted to capture that magic of getting lost on the maps and spending ages with paper and pen. The development context was strongly marked by a resistance to excessive modernization and a passion for the roots of horror. The studio, instead of seeking to fully adapt to the market, seems intent on celebrating the stumbles, the limitations, and even the somewhat makeshift solutions of the genre. This creates a peculiar identity, something that vibrates nostalgia but bets on the ambiance, the mystery, and the constant discomfort. As someone who enjoys this type of proposal, I am genuinely excited to see a small studio backing its ideas, even if it might sound repetitive to those accustomed to high budgets. It is not a game made for everyone, but for those who have patience with root horror and enjoy exploring the guts of horror without rushing to leave the nightmare. Tormented Souls 2 dives headfirst into the dark atmosphere of classic survival horror, reinforcing all the narrative weight of the original and delivering a personal and claustrophobic horror experience. The game presents Caroline Walker to us again, this time in a desperate fight to save her sister Anna from a sinister cult in an abandoned clinic in the mountains of Chile. Right from the start, the convent setting and the constant presence of the macabre nuns create an unsettling screen. That feeling that everything can go wrong at any moment dominates the player from beginning to end. If there is one thing that holds me in this game's story, it is the way it is revealed little by little. No easy answers. Caroline needs to explore every corner of the convent, finding documents, clues, and fitting together the pieces of a dark puzzle. The mystery is dense. The plot mixes occultism, supernatural rituals, and a tragic past, all enveloped in an aura of despair. It seems that the more the protagonist discovers, the more she realizes that the terror comes not only from the physical creatures, but also from distorted memories and the people who were supposed to protect. The relationship between the two sisters is the emotional engine of the game. Anna's inexplicable illness is the catalyst of the plot. Attacks, visions, changes in behavior. She becomes hostage to something beyond medical comprehension. Caroline's despair is palpable, and it is impossible not to feel the weight of this journey. This dynamic creates genuine moments of tension. Anna is always between danger and redemption, and Caroline is never sure if she will be able to save her or just survive to tell the story. What shines here is how the terror goes beyond physical threats. The cult led by Mother Lucia seems to manipulate everyone around Villa Hesse. Nuns with a disturbing appearance roam the corridors as if they were guardians of some ancient secret, and the line between the religious and the profane becomes increasingly blurred. I felt as if the game wanted to provoke you. How far would you go to save someone? How many horrors would you endure? The atmosphere is suffocating, and the narrative knows how to use this to its advantage. Throughout the adventure, Caroline gains access to supernatural abilities that allow her to travel between alternative realities. This is a screenplay success because it is not just a gameplay resource. It directly influences the decisions and consequences of the story. Altering events in the past affects the present, making every choice laden with weight. The convent, the tunnels, the school, and the abandoned village form scenarios in which each location seems to hold a distorted truth. And it is impossible not to feel part of this interactive nightmare. The monsters that cross Caroline's path represent the triumph of body horror. They are bizarre mixtures of flesh, metal, and madness. Wire, nails, crucifixes, everything fused into a grotesque design. Facing these bosses is like facing a nightmare straight from the developers' minds, and every fight brings a sense of anguish. The worst part is that combat is not always the best option. Sometimes running away is all that remains. This fits with the narrative of helplessness and impotence that the game wants to convey. The story of Tormented Souls 2 is filled with twists and possible endings, depending on the player's choices. Every document read, every puzzle solved, every event altered in the past, all this influences the sisters' destiny. The script plays with themes such as guilt, sacrifice, and redemption in a personal way. The terror is always intimate, and every part of the path seems like an emotional blow. At the end of the journey, it is impossible not to feel that the experience has truly moved the structures of classic survival horror, including in the narrative details. For those who like a layered horror story, Tormented Souls 2 is a treat and will leave you thinking long after the credits. The gameplay is a true homage to the old guard of survival horrors, but with a refinement that places it perfectly between the old and the modern. The game maintains the classic DNA that fans love so much: fixed cameras, heavy movement, and a constant sense of vulnerability. But now all of this sounds more fluid and natural. The developer Dual Effect managed to better balance the control of Caroline Walker. She is still slow and tense to control, which reinforces the fear, but the responses to commands are smoother and more precise. It is that typical feeling of 90s games, where every step seemed like a life-or-death decision, but now with a touch of convenience and accessibility. The camera is another point that remains firm as a signature of the series. There are still carefully chosen fixed angles that enhance the atmosphere, but the game allows certain dynamic movements in moments of combat or exploration, which provides a very welcome visual fluidity. This mix between static and organic reinforces the cinematic atmosphere of horror, and many frames are used artistically, the type of shot that makes you stop just to absorb the horror of the environment. Sometimes this camera choice hinders combat, making some encounters slightly unfair, but it still contributes to the game's charm. In terms of ambiance, every room, every corridor of Villa Hesse seems like an invitation to despair. The combat follows the series pattern, tense and calculated. Ammunition is scarce and you rarely feel prepared. The old pneumatic pistol returns, but there are new improvised weapons that reinforce the more physical and desperate side of the confrontations. Caroline is not a warrior. She is a survivor. The feeling the game conveys is one of constant oppression. Even facing a single enemy already seems like a psychological challenge. One thing that stands out is the visceral way the blows and shots sound. The impact is heavy, the sound dry and uncomfortable. It is not a combat made to please. It is designed to make you tense, and in this, the game hits the mark perfectly. The puzzles also deserve to be highlighted, and they are one of the pillars of the gameplay. They maintain the classic style of absurd enigmas, but coherent within the logic of that world of nightmare. Combining items, examining objects, and solving codes continues to be an essential part of the progression. The biggest success here is the balance. The challenges are instigating, but rarely frustrating. The mechanic of manipulating objects, such as turning a key or fitting symbols into specific positions, creates a physical relationship with the environment, very close to the feeling of the first Resident Evil games. It is a game that rewards attention and patience, and this translates into a deliberately slow pace loaded with tension. There is also the inventory system that received specific adjustments. Now it is possible to pre-select up to 4 items for quick use, something essential amidst the slowness of combat. This improvement maintains the retro spirit, but adds a layer of practicality that the first game did not have. The interface itself remains deliberately antiquated, with slow menus and a deliberate feeling that every action has weight. It is a decision that can frustrate modern players, but those who understand the proposal realize that it is part of the immersion. Every movement Caroline makes, opening a door, using an item, reloading a weapon, has that pause that increases discomfort. One of the aspects that most impressed me is how the game maintains horror both in the gameplay and in the interaction with the environment itself. Being in the dark is a real threat. Caroline can be consumed by the shadow if she does not stay near the light. This mechanic is cruel and brilliant at the same time, as it transforms something as trivial as lighting a candle into an act of survival. Everything pushes you forward with fear, and even the simple act of examining a room becomes an experience of pure tension. The limitation of vision, combined with the impeccable sound design, gives the game a sensorial texture of horror that few modern titles can achieve. The gameplay of Tormented Souls 2 is about control, fragility, and discomfort. It does not try to be a modern action game. It wants to put you in a constant state of alert, and in that, it is brilliant. I felt that every encounter, every enigma, and every breath in Villa Hesse existed to remind you that Caroline is alone and defenseless in a world that hates the light. It is a more meticulous experience, sometimes cruel, but always rewarding. The graphics impress from the very first moment, bringing a clear evolution in relation to its predecessor, but without giving up that retro atmosphere that delights fans of classic survival horrors like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The use of Unreal Engine allowed dual effect to create living scenarios, where every dirty corridor and every blood-stained room transmit a heavy atmosphere, reinforced by very competent lighting. I felt that the game makes a point of creating an environment where fear is transmitted visually, both in the details of the objects and in the aggressive contrast of shadows, always leaning towards the darkest and most suffocating side possible. The retro touch in the graphics is a separate charm. It is not about pure realism, but a caprice in the art direction that mixes elements of gore with the supernatural. The design of the nuns, villains who steal the scene, is a horrifying spectacle. Every detail from their attire to their facial expression seems designed to disturb and mark the player. The visual carries its own identity, taking references from the 90s, but with a polish that makes everything more pleasant to modern eyes, without losing that feeling of nostalgia of playing a remastered classic. The richness of detail is impressive in the internal scenarios, especially in the hospital areas and enclosed environments, which abuse the darkness as an argument for tension. In fact, at times, I found the darkness even exaggerated. You really need to adjust the brightness of the TV or monitor, otherwise certain details are lost. Despite this, the choice seems very well calculated. The dark serves both to create discomfort and to hide small textures, reinforcing the vibe of something might be watching you all the time. Even with all this visual evolution, the graphics are not exempt from some stumbles, at least in the demo. I noticed small drops in resolution and a certain stiffness in the CGs, especially in the vegetation right in the first external scenes. In the internal areas, this detail is less evident because the focus always falls on the hostile and sinister environment of the clinic and the convent, where the gameplay actually takes place. These are details that can certainly be improved in the final version, but which in no way diminish the brilliance of the whole. Another thing that caught my attention was how well the game explores the parallax factor of the fixed cameras. reinforcing the discomfort and at the same time enhancing the pre-rendered backgrounds, but now with much more life, floating particles, reflections, and small environmental animations. This makes every new scenario almost an invitation to stop, observe, and admire every aged texture, every crack in the wall, everything that tells a story even when there is no speech or text on the screen. Overall, I would say that the graphics of Tormented Souls 2 are like a love letter to fans of classic horror. They are not the most technically advanced, but almost everything here has a narrative and sensory function. From the corridors of Villa Hesse to the color-deprived external areas, everything collaborates for an absolute immersion, which makes every scare, every invisible or only suggested detail, compose a picture that manages to move our imagination. A true gift for those who miss that dark and less obvious visual of the 90s, but want to experience it with the refinement and fluidity that only modern engines provide. The performance of Tormented Souls 2 presents an interesting balance between visual quality and fluidity, especially considering that the game uses Unreal Engine 5. Overall, the experience is solid in terms of frame rate, with most analyses pointing out that the game runs smoothly both on PC and on latest generation consoles like the PS5 Pro and Xbox Series X. However, it is not free from some oscillations, especially in environments with complex lighting and denser scenarios. The fluidity can drop to about 40 to 50 FPS in heavier moments, something that bothers the desired standard of constant 60 FPS a little, but does not ruin the immersion or the sense of horror that the game wants to convey. On PC, the recommended specifications that the developers indicate for an ideal experience are an Intel Core i5-8600K processor or higher and 12 GB of RAM, with cards that support ray tracing well to take advantage of the visual effects. In my test done with ultra settings at 1440p, with the RTX 4060 Ti I managed to maintain 60 FPS most of the time, even with advanced texture and lighting activated. Even so, I felt occasional drops in frame rate, but nothing too frequent. The options for performance optimization, such as adjusting TSR, provide a good balance for players who want graphic quality without losing much performance. On PS5 Pro, the performance is also mostly stable, with the promise of 60 FPS and graphics in 4K HDR. For a game that bets so much on atmosphere and tension, this stability is crucial, as drops in FPS would break the immersion of the claustrophobic corridors and tense scenes. Even so, I felt occasional drops in FPS in more complex areas of the map, but this may be linked to specific issues like VR and optimizations that will still be adjusted with future patches. Overall, the experience is good for those with a high-performance console. One important thing to highlight in the performance is that, despite the gameplay being stable, the character animations are still a bit rigid, which is not a performance problem itself, but affects the general feeling of fluidity and movement. This may be more connected to the art and technical direction than to hardware limitations, but it is a point that I believe impacts the immersion experience for those who, like me, highly value natural movement in horror games. Another aspect that leaves the impression of care and performance is the way the game manages lighting and sound. Light is an essential element for the climate of tension, and the game uses a careful technique to balance light and shadow in real time, which could greatly impact performance, but was well optimized to run smoothly on most platforms. The sound also follows this line, with detailed effects that do not weigh on performance, but strongly contribute to the atmosphere, something that for me makes all the difference in the experience. Even if the performance mechanic is not the direct focus, I see the performance of Tormented Souls 2 as a well-balanced example of how survival horror games can combine high visual quality with solid performance. In a genre where atmosphere and mood are so important to the experience, stable performance at 60 FPS is almost mandatory, and the game delivers that most of the time. Even with small occasional drops, the immersion is not compromised for me, and the detailed graphic style, combined with fluidity, creates a tense and genuine environment that captivated me from beginning to end. Is it worth buying the game at launch? For me, if you are a fan of nostalgic survival horror and enjoy this more classic style, it is an interesting bet, as the game brings significant graphical and technical improvements over the first one, in addition to evolving the franchise's ideas without losing its essence. However, if you are not such a fan of this traditional style, which favors a constant feeling of tension, challenging puzzles, and combat that might seem a bit clunky, it might be better to wait for more complete reviews and possible post-launch adjustments. I think the game will especially appeal to those who like a challenge in the right measure, to explore labyrinthine environments and miss that heavy and unique atmosphere of old games. Tormented Souls 2 does not rely on exaggerated jump scares. The terror comes from the ambiance, the subtle sounds, and the constant feeling that something is wrong, which is something that for me is an important differential. If you enjoy psychological horror with a slightly more mysterious narrative, where the focus is more on suspense and ambiance than on monsters jumping in your face, this is an experience that has everything to grip you. But you need to enjoy an experience that can be slow at times, where exploration and puzzle solving demand attention and patience. I personally really enjoy this type of game, but I understand that it can be frustrating for those who prefer more direct action, for example. The gameplay maintains the classic tank control, which for some may seem outdated, but which for me helps maintain that climate of vulnerability so characteristic of the genre. Furthermore, the game brings improvements in the fluidity of movements and allows a certain customization in the controls for those who prefer something more modern. The mechanic of switching between dimensions to solve puzzles is a nice touch that adds depth to the exploration. If you like experiences that require strategic thinking and not just quick reflexes, you will have a lot of fun. It is a game clearly made for fans of classic horror. Those who long for the games of the PlayStation 1 era and the first generations of PlayStation 2 and Xbox, who value puzzles, limited resources, and a story told in an indirect and fragmented way. It is also ideal for those who do not care about ultra-realistic graphics, but rather the creation of a dense and oppressive atmosphere. If you are the type who enjoys horror narratives with a touch of gothic suspense and do not mind feeling lost and cornered, this game has your name written on it. My personal opinion, if you are part of this group, I would recommend without thinking twice to get the game at launch to enjoy the fresh sensations of a survival horror with classic roots, updated for the current generation. On the other hand, if you are not such a fan of this type of gameplay and are thinking of something more accessible or modern, it might be worth waiting a little longer until you see community feedback, eventual patches, and perhaps some promotion. In my case, since I enjoy this aesthetic and game mode, I would buy it right away as the game delivers exactly what I like. Nostalgia with a modern touch, good challenge, and a heavy atmosphere. For those who have already played the first Tormented Souls, the recommendation is clear. Play the first one before the launch of the second to understand the universe and appreciate the evolution in the sequel's ideas. The experience becomes richer, and the impact of the second game much greater. For those who have never played anything similar, know that it is a title that demands patience, attention, and a genuine passion for the classic survival horror genre. If these points match your taste, Tormented Souls 2 at launch is a valid bet and can be one of the best experiences for nostalgic fans looking for a return to the old school of horror. Well, that was my review. I hope you liked it and see you next time.